the most revered reviewer, Kirkus Reviews, and we were so proud of it, we put it on the cover. Kirkus Reviews says an honest, raw, and often graphic memoir. And if Charlie had been here and read that, he would have been on the phone to me, cackling his ass off and saying, I love, my favorite part is the often graphic.
Welcome to another episode of the Gay Barchives show, where we explore gay history one bar at a time. I'm your host, Art Smith, and I invite you to check out our YouTube channel at youtube.com/@gaybarchives. And of course, subscribe. Our special guest today is Richard Eldredge. He's a contributing editor to Atlanta Magazine, the editor-in-chief of Eldredge ATL, and the publisher and co-author of The Bitch of the South, Charlie Brown's memoir. So welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you, Art.
It is such a delight to finally connect with you. I've known about your journalism for a while. I've known about what projects you've been working on recently, one of which we're going to talk about at some length in a little bit. But I wanted to start off by asking you, what is your first memory of a gay bar?
I have two answers for you, Art. The first is I grew up in New Jersey, in South Jersey, and I was a kid, and there was a miniature golf course in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And the miniature golf course that I would play at with my cousin as a kid was right next to a gay bar named Gatsby's. It opened at the height of disco in 1978. And I think it lasted for maybe the better part of 20 years. And I just remember Sunday tea dances. I'd be playing miniature golf and watching these gay men in fabulous outfits, and there would be toga party nights, and I would just watch all of these guys going into this amazing bar. And of course, the second bar that really was the very first time I saw a legitimate drag show was Charlie Brown's Cabaret upstairs at Backstreet, Atlanta, in the very early 1990s. And it was right when Charlie was about maybe a year, 6 months, 8 months into Charlie's reign at Backstreet. And I could not believe what I was seeing. It was, you could have dropped me, onto a new planet. I had not seen anything like this in my entire life. And here we are all these years later, and let's just say Charlie made an impact.
Indeed. And I want to thank you, by the way, for wearing the t-shirt I designed for Backstreet Atlanta, which on the bottom it says home of Charlie Brown's Cabaret.
Home of Charlie Brown's Cabaret. Yeah, and, absolutely.
And we raised some money for Charlie's recovery when she had her accident a few years back. So thank you for wearing that. And I'm glad you had a chance to experience some of that Backstreet glamour. I first really became aware of your journalism not living in Atlanta when the Atlanta Magazine in October of 2020 did a special Pride issue. Mm-hmm. And in that issue, they had a lot of focus on Backstreet, because Backstreet, of course, is the iconic Atlanta bar. It lasted nearly 30 years. Yeah. It was huge. For more than half of its existence, it was open 24 hours a day. Mm-hmm. And in that same issue, the October 2020 issue, I'm quoted as saying that I went to visit Atlanta in the end of 1982 for a New Year's weekend and fell in love with Backstreet and moved to Atlanta a week later. So I know the impact that Backstreet had on the Atlanta scene and on the gay community in the South. Tell us a little bit about that article, that issue of Atlanta Magazine, and the articles that you contributed to it.
Yeah, so the editor-in-chief of Atlanta Magazine at the time, Betsy Riley, it was her brainchild. The Pride at 50 issue was her brainchild. It was on the editorial calendar all year. And then, of course, we had to produce it in the summer of 2020. Well, of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so Betsy called and asked if I would be the guest editor of the issue, and we were all in lockdown. We had to do it on screens like this. We had to do it by phone on Zoom. No one ever met in person the entire time we were producing the issue. But one of the stories that our publisher Sean McGinnis asked if we could include. And Sean is perhaps one of the most heterosexual people you'll ever meet in your life. But he said, I'd love it if we could have a story on Backstreet. And as you mentioned, Art, Backstreet was one of two 24-hour liquor licenses in the city of Atlanta. And so what that meant was early in the evening, it would be this 10,000 square foot, three-story gay bar, gay disco, with this mammoth dance floor. And then later in the morning, when all the other bars in the city closed, everybody came to Backstreet. And so it was this melting pot of humanity that, as Charlie talks about in the book, sometimes didn't always get along with each other. But what I loved was Sean's suggestion that Backstreet be one of the focal points. And so I knew the very first phone call I needed to make. As a reporter in Atlanta, I had been interviewing Charlie and getting quotes from Charlie for 30 years. And so I knew that Charlie would be the linchpin to a story on Backstreet. And so we came upon this idea of doing an oral history of Backstreet. And I knew that Charlie and his husband, Fred, would be the linchpin interview. I knew that if Charlie sat for an interview, no one else associated with Backstreet could say no. And that's precisely what happened. Charlie said yes, and the floodgates opened, and we got this amazing oral history. And so, again, in October, when the issue comes out, we're still all in lockdown, but we did a Backstreet reunion. Atlanta Magazine hosted a Backstreet reunion on Zoom. It was the first time in 2.5 years that Charlie got in drag. And Charlie was in drag sitting on his living room couch next to his husband, Fred. And we had an hour Backstreet reunion on Zoom. And the next morning, Charlie texted me and he said, I would love to keep the conversation going. I've been thinking about writing my memoirs. What do you think? And here we are, Art.
The rest is history. Now, as I said, I've known Charlie for decades. And Charlie, even in the early years, when I first met Charlie, I knew he was, an amazing performer, that he could captivate an entire room in seconds. But he was never one to brag or to blow his own horn. I never even knew, the first 10 years I knew him, that he had any titles at all. He wasn't one of those queens that everywhere he went, he had to be introduced as former Miss Gay Georgia 1981 or whatever. He was always just Mr. Charlie Brown. And I hardly ever saw him without Fred. Fred was the best support I think he ever could have had. I'm not sure his career would have gone where it did if he didn't have a husband as supportive as Fred has been over the decades. But Charlie was always a great person. He was always very down to earth. You could very much see his Tennessee country roots, with or without the drag on.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm glad that you mentioned Fred, because you're exactly right. Fred was, and Charlie took, was very, very deliberate in the writing of this book about Fred's contributions to his career. And Charlie is the first person to tell you, whether it's in print or in person, that it's because of Fred that he got to the top tier that he got to. And and said, if you don't have somebody in your corner, if you don't have a Fred Wise in your corner, Charlie said, in the book, the road is long and difficult. And so I'm glad that you mentioned Fred, because Fred is one of the themes throughout the book. I mean, they were together over 40 years, met in 1977 at the Carousel in Knoxville, in the ladies' room at the Carousel in Knoxville. And I'll leave it to the readers to uncover the rest of that story. But Hollywood has these meet cute moments in movies. That has Hollywood script written all over it. Fred and Charlie's initial meeting.
Yes, I when I read that story, I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. It's like, everybody knows that Charlie Brown has done some really cool things on stage and has a really powerful presence. But the little stories like that, the whole evolution of how they met and what happened in the bathroom is just captivating. I mean, as you know, when you sent me the digital copy of the book so I could prepare for this, I read the first half of the book after dinner one night and finished the second half. I was almost finished with it when I realized I hadn't poured my first cup of coffee, and that's kind of weird. But it just had me, chained to the book. I had to read it.
That is a testament to Charlie Brown's storytelling, I think. The fact that you would deprive yourself of caffeine, art,
I didn't say
right
that.
there. Well, one of the things that I've talked a lot, and tried to get publishers interested in this book for a long time, and I always described it as three stories. It's this LGBTQ history from a member of a generation that was decimated by the AIDS epidemic. And so you have a survivor's story. And you also have this amazing drag history of America through half a century. And then the third leg of the storytelling stool, of course, is Fred and Charlie's love story.
It is, and it highlights some things that I have known about because I've known some of the players in the story for a long time. Jerry Peak being one of them, Charlie's first onstage employer in Nashville, Tennessee. But like the story of the fire at Watch Your Hat and Coat Saloon. That's something that a lot of people don't realize, especially younger people, do not realize that not only in the South, but across the country, even in the years following Stonewall, there were a lot of acts of violence, of arson, of all kinds of attacks on gay people and gay spaces. And it puts in perspective how much different it is now, even though we've had some tragedies in recent years. For the most part, I think when we go to a gay space, for the most part, I think when we go to a gay space now, we don't anticipate that. We're not concerned that somebody's going to come and set the place on fire while we're in there. For the most part, we're feeling pretty safe. And there are a lot of places around the country that just don't have the perspective on the history. And that was, to me, was another point that came out in the book, that for one, I'm sure there are millions of people across the country that never even heard of Watch Your Hat and Coat.
Yeah.
But
well, so Art, here's some information for you and your viewers on the Watch Your Hat and Coat Saloon fire. So Charlie told me about the details of this for the book, and I went off. I started my career at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution daily newspaper here, and so I have the newspaper reporter mindset. And so when Charlie told me this amazing story about this fire in 1973, that he was on stage, he was at work when it happened. And so I started digging into, there are old digital copies of the Tennessean available. And so I started digging into the news media coverage of it. And also, being an amateur, queer historian, I also found out a few things about where the Watcher Hat and Coat Saloon fire played into two other fires, all three of which involved the very progressive Metropolitan Community Church. And so the first fire was in Los Angeles in January 1973. They burned that to the ground. And then what I discovered, Charlie could never identify, said we never knew the origin of the fire. It was ruled arson, but no one was ever held responsible. Well, then going through the old issues of the Tennessean newspaper, I discovered that on the second floor of the Watcher Hat and Coat Saloon, the Metropolitan Community Church held Sunday services. And they ran an ad in the Tennessean with the same street address as the club. And they ran this ad all the time that said, black, white, gay, straight, be yourself, come as you are, the Lord won't mind. And so there was one fire in Los Angeles in January. This happens in May. And then, of course, your historians who are tuned in will know that on June 25th, 1973, less than a month after the Watcher Hat and Coat Saloon fire, the upstairs lounge in New Orleans was targeted. And many, many parishioners of the MCC were there at the time. And so we don't have any conclusive proof, but it's interesting that all three MCC venues were targeted by these hate-filled folks who wanted to destroy these places.
Absolutely. And I know when I was starting to do my research into the gay bar scene, which incidentally, it all started about 5 years ago, at the end of 2019, with a conversation with Vicky Vera. So not only did my move to Atlanta was inspired by Backstreet, but also starting the Gay Barchives project kind of evolved out of a conversation with Vicky Vera, who was one of the two final owners of Backstreet before they closed. And her family had owned it since the 70s.
Yeah.
So when I was doing my research, I stumbled across an article about the upstairs lounge fire, which is the one you're referring to in New Orleans. And I did not know that that had ever happened. It was not part of the history that any of us gays heard about anywhere, I guess, unless you lived in New Orleans or knew somebody there.
Right.
And I was really shocked to find out that up until the time of the Pulse shootings in 2016, that was the biggest loss of life in an act of violence against the gay bar ever.
Yeah, absolutely.
But and the minute Pulse happened, they said, worst tragedy to ever strike a gay bar. But right. We never knew what the previous worst was, and that held the alleged record, if you want to call it that. That held that place for over 40 years as this big tragedy. And you're right, it is kind of odd to connect them all to MCC, and all within 6 months of each other, basically. But it's good that these stories, people are starting now to connect the dots and hear the stories and learn that it didn't only impact, people in, for instance, New Orleans, if in fact it happened to be the same person or group of people that were inspired to do it in Nashville and in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
It just shows how connected some of these events and people can be.
It was amazing when I started pulling out these details. Of course, I called Charlie right away, and I said, "Hey, here's the timeline of these three fires," and he was like, "We had no idea that there could be a connection." And he said, "I remember the church meeting upstairs where we had all of our drag." And he said, and that was, we shared the space with the church because we had all of our drag, all of our costuming up there. And he said, it certainly stands to reason that this could have been the motivation. So it was fascinating. The other thing that I really love about getting the Watcher hat and coat saloon material into the book is that it is literally backstage where Mr. Charlie Brown is created. And I love that we get to take this brassy comic creation that came out of Charles H. Dillard's imagination and his background, and we track it from there to Charlie Brown's debut on stage at the Sweet Gumhead in Atlanta. And then we track the trajectory of the character that started out as kind of this glamorous Las Vegas showgirl. I think readers will be fascinated to see some of the very early photos of Charlie Brown in Bitch of the South, because it is quite far afield from the Bitch of the South character that we end up with at the end of the book.
Absolutely. Although Charlie did seem to keep a certain degree of that glamour, even in his, sarcastic routines and his, audience baiting and whatever else he did on stage. He always had a certain amount of glamour to him. He had beautiful costuming. I don't think anybody who's ever met Charlie will ever forget those nails. It's just there are certain things about Charlie and his performances that are just burned, into your memory. They're etched in there forever. And even the last time I saw Charlie, which was, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, when I was in Atlanta for Pride, nothing had changed. In fact, he still had an immense amount of energy, still had that great smile, still went, dressed to the nines and did the whole, he didn't just kind of rest on his laurels and said, look, bitches, I've been doing this for 50 years. I'm going to come out as I want to. He still gave 100% every time.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right, Art. Charlie on stage, the creation, she was glamorous. And Charlie took great pains to make sure that she was glamorous on stage. The outfits, the wigs, the jewelry, and of course, those nails.
But yet, he never took himself too seriously. So, I remember numerous times watching him perform and him ripping his wig off at the end of the show and saying, basically, if you can't laugh at an old, fat, bald bitch, on stage, then you have no business being out after dark. And the book just gives you so much depth and history into how Charlie got to be from, Watcher hat and coat all the way to his final days, performing at Lips and at the Eagle. Yeah. And it's really kind of amazing to follow that journey and to see all the different steps that it took and to read all those little stories about, this happened here and that happened there. And to really kind of get inside that head, because most people, even if you'd known Charlie for a long time, you didn't necessarily have the time to sit down for hours and listen to the stories. I mean, how many hours did you spend listening to stories about Charlie Brown's life to get this book put together?
We did 8.5 months of weekly phone conversations, and they would range from 30 minutes to 90 minutes a week. We set a time. It was Mondays at 11 o'clock. And Art, it is still on my phone. At 10:45 every Monday, I still get an alert to interview Charlie. And I haven't had the heart to take it out of my phone. But as I like to describe the book to people, I said, instead of Tuesdays with Maury, this was Mondays with Mr. Charlie Brown. And we would, as Charlie would say, have ourselves a time. It was Charlie, me, and Fred in the middle of a pandemic, finding something to laugh about, finding stories that he wanted for the book. And so we would take a different section of his life every week. And it took us 8.5 months. And we started in 1949 when he's born in tiny Westmoreland, Tennessee, to as the grandson of a missionary Baptist preacher. That's one of the biggest shocks of me talking to Charlie about his early years. So you think about, Charlie being the grandson of a Southern Baptist, a missionary Baptist preacher. But one of the things that I really love about the book is that in Charlie's own way, especially during the AIDS crisis, Charlie is conducting his own sort of ministry. He's just doing it in a very different way from a pulpit in a building with a steeple. He did it on stage, but his commitment to people's well-being, making sure that people were being taken care of, making sure that people had money raised for them in what would become the final weeks of their life during an epidemic. All of those things are, are teachings that started in his childhood and being exposed to the church. And so, that's one of the through lines that I really love about this project is because, unlike a lot of drag memoirs of drag performers, and we've had, RuPaul just came out with one, the Lady Chablis had one. What I really love about Charlie's is that it's clearly written by Charlie Dillard and not Mr. Charlie Brown.
Yes, I remember when I was reading part of the book and I sent you an email pointing out something that was grammatically less than perfect. And I said to you, I noticed this, but I'm sure it's probably intentional because I can hear Charlie's voice saying exactly that way.
And that was, as a journalist, I wouldn't have strung those words together in that way. But I wasn't a journalist on this. I was bringing my journalistic training to this book, but I was Charlie's co-writer. And so I had to nail Charlie's voice. And let me tell you, Art, there is nothing scarier than submitting the first two sample chapters to Charlie Brown and his husband of 45 years to get their feedback on, am I getting the voice right? And we tape recorded or digitally recorded every phone conversation that we had for 8.5 months. And so, when I talk to college students about interviewing these days, I always tell them to record it because what somebody tells you is important, but how they choose to tell you is equally important. And so going on those digital recordings of all those conversations with Charlie, thankfully, I learned through osmosis, listening back to all of those, how Charlie phrased things. And there was you could give me a Pulitzer tomorrow, and it wouldn't matter as much as Charlie and Fred calling me after they got those first two chapters and said, baby, darling, you nailed it.
Yeah, Charlie was quite the character and so genuine. You knew that when Charlie said something like that to you, it wasn't like, oh, darling, it's fabulous, and just saying the words for no particular reason. You knew Charlie did not mince words. So when Charlie had an opinion, well, you better be ready for the opinion because it was not necessarily going to be the politically correct thing that you were hoping to hear. But yeah, I can attest to the fact that book just screams Charlie Brown. Every page, every story, there was nothing in there that I looked at and said, "Oh, well, that doesn't sound like Charlie. That doesn't sound like something Charlie would do." It was really amazing, and I know we all have favorite moments from the book, favorite stories from the book. I know my eyes lit up when she was telling the story about being Grand Marshal in the Atlanta Pride Parade. And instantly in my head, I had a vision of her standing in this brilliant cobalt blue sequin gown to the floor on a 95-degree day in June in Atlanta, sitting in the back of my convertible, and I'm looking up in the rear view mirror, seeing all this sparkling glitter as she's going down the street. And I thought, I can see it. I'm reliving that very experience just from the mention in the book. But over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, I've done well over 150 interviews with people talking about their gay bar stories. And a number of them, partially because I live there, partially because there are active groups on Facebook, like I Partied at Backstreet, that love to interact. But I've interviewed quite a number of people, including Ted Binkley, Mark Jones, Raven, Roy Roger Oldenkamp, Marty Paget, and all of these people felt somehow that Charlie Brown had to be part of their interview.
Yeah.
Like, that just goes to say how much of an impact Charlie had on the entertainment scene. Yeah. In Atlanta. Everybody wanted to talk about, oh, well, I remember when I choreographed this number for Charlie Brown's pageant. I think that was yeah. Mark Jones that said that. Or, yeah. Raven going in for a Thursday night, I think it was, a Thursday night talent competition, yeah. and being such a brilliant performer that in very short notice, she was offered a cast position, which usually took months or years to get at Backstreet. And they all had, loving, admiring things to say about Charlie Brown. And so I'm glad that there's a book out there and so close after his passing that, you were basically wrapping up the last tidbits of the book when he passed away rather unexpectedly. So it's, basically hot off the press. I mean, we're talking about something that people still have many, many people still have very recent fond memories of experiences with Charlie Brown.
Yeah. Yeah. And I am so grateful to you, Art, for sharing your Pride Parade story of Charlie, because one of the things that I really love is that in this book, we get to dig into Charlie's life as, as an advocate, as somebody who blazed trails for queer people. And the road was not always, the road was often rocky, and trying to get drag into the Pride Parade was, Charlie Brown is 100%, he was the first. Atlanta Pride, like a lot of other Pride celebrations, they wanted to keep drag out. They wanted to keep the Leathermen out of the parade. They wanted, as Charlie puts it in the book, they wanted the white guy with the izod with the popped collar. That was somehow socially acceptable to have on the evening news coverage of the parade. And Charlie fought his way into the Atlanta Pride Parade. And so I love that you got to drive him when he finally got to put his feet up and get driven into the parade, because in the early years, Charlie will talks about walking that parade route in heels. And he and Lena Luft both talk about, the early years of that parade were no picnic, and then on top of everything else, having to walk in heels. Yeah. We solicited a lot of terrific blurbs for the book, but my personal favorite, and Atlanta playwright Topher Payne said, "This raw, funny, delicious memoir reminds us that in every battle for queer equality, there was a brave, badass drag queen like Mr. Charlie Brown leading the charge. His story is our history."
It's just an amazing story, and I'm so glad that you actually got to bring it, to the public. As I understand from your post, just I guess yesterday, you're basically cutting off pre-orders on the hardcover limited edition book that is coming out first. How soon will it be before there's another edition of the book, either paperback or hardcover, for all those people who are going to see this interview and go, damn, I can't order it now? When will they be able to order the next version?
Well, the good news, Art, is that we will have plenty of hardback editions. We had to cut off the pre-orders because we needed a final number to clear the decks for accounting purposes when we place the bulk order of the hardback. But we are already planning for next year, 2025. There will be a trade paperback edition, and we're also planning an ebook for those who like to read on Kindle or a tablet. So there will be two more options. The paperback will have a whole new cover. It will look more like a beach read. It will be cheaper, and so it'll be much more portable for those who prefer their print. And it'll be available on platforms like Amazon and Barnes and Noble and things like that. So we're going to have different editions of the book available. And one of the other things that I'm really thrilled about this book is Charlie. There is this wonderful, anyone who's familiar with the drag community at all will see a lot of names that you recognize. And there are these amazing stories about Charlie meeting some of these legends of drag. There are stories about Diamond Lil, about how he met Lily White, who would go on to work with him for decades. Gilda Golden was a roommate in Florida before we ever met her on
and co-conspirator.
Atlanta.
A roommate and co-conspirator.
Co-conspirator, and there was a lot of thievery involved. I'll just say that. Mickey Day, who is this legendary Atlanta drag performer, rescues Charlie from, just you never think it's bad news when you win a pageant out of a state. But, there was a pageant that Charlie won very early on in his career that he needed a police escort to get out of town. So I'll just leave it there. But I love that is like where you meet Mickey Day in Charlie's life. And, as you mentioned, Phoenix and Gigi Monroe, we get their origin stories in Charlie's book. And so it's like this who's who of drag in America. Not only is it Charlie's story, but how he interacts and intersects with these other. There's a very young RuPaul that comes to see him at Illusions in the early 1980s. And thanks to Ru's new memoir, there's a reflection of Charlie in the book, and so, we were literally done with the book, Art. And I'm on the phone with Charlie one day. I mean, Charlie had a bound manuscript of the book. I thought, okay, we're finished. And I'm on the phone one day with Charlie, and he just says matter-of-factly, oh, well, that reminds me of the shows I did in Savannah with Lady Chablis. I'm sorry, what? Oh, yeah, we met in the 70s, Rich. No, I don't know that, Charlie. Oh, yeah, we met in the mid 70s. And I'm sorry, what? Well, let's set a Monday morning call next week and get some of these on tape. So we actually did follow-up interviews for some of the, I call it late breaking material that ended up in Charlie's memoir. Another funny story, I was almost done with the book. I was closing in on a final draft, and again, you're on the phone with Mr. Charlie Brown, so you have no idea what will come out of his mouth next. So he said, oh, that was like the time I was on Sally Jesse Raphael. I'm sorry, what? Oh, yeah, we filmed that in 1990 in Macon, Georgia. So, of course, Art, if you Google anything these days on YouTube, you'll come up with the YouTube clip. So I sat there, I watched the entire hour of Sally Jesse Raphael. And Charlie, I would advise your viewers to please Google it. You will not be disappointed. but I watched the whole thing, took notes, and I called Charlie the next day and I said, and as Topher Payne says, he was a complete badass on that show. And was just, funny and did a Judd's duet as a drag number, as you point out, yanked off his wig at the end, and Charlie had plotted with Sally's producers. He didn't yank off the wig during the rehearsal. He wanted to do it to shock Sally in the moment when they were taping, and so suddenly you see the camera cut to Sally in the audience, and so I just love that Charlie orchestrated this entire thing with the crew of the Sally Jesse Raphael. So every time you thought you were done with the stories, the night I presented the bound manuscript of the book to Charlie at the end of his show at the Atlanta Eagle on a Saturday night, he comes up to me and says, "Oh, I had a fender bender today, and I got a story that's got to go in the book." And of course, he was right, because here's Charlie in full drag and having to deal with a cop. Now, anybody who picks up this book and reads it will know that there are multiple run-ins that Charlie Brown has with various law enforcement officers throughout his career. Not all of them go well, let's just say. So I knew that this story coming at the end of the book would resonate, and it certainly does.
I am so glad that you took the time to sit down and talk to Charlie week after week, month after month, to get these stories, into print and get them out where everybody can see them. I know it was a labor of love. I know it took a lot of time and effort to put it together. But there was also another part that a lot of people probably don't know about. After you got it all together, it had to get published.
Yes.
And everybody thinks, and I get this all the time. People say, "When are you going to write your book? When are you going to write your book?" Well, there are not publishers lined outside my door with advance checks saying, "Here's 50 grand. Why don't you start on your book?" Ain't happening. I don't care how famous you are. Well, that's not true, but I don't care how knowledgeable you are about a topic. I don't care how long you've been around in your particular little gay bubble. It's not an easy task. And you found that out when you had this, what you consider to be a blockbuster book, sitting, in a manuscript form, waiting to go to a publisher, and there's no publisher. So
Yeah.
what did you do?
It was frustrating for me because it's Charlie's story and it was important to Charlie. And so I shopped this thing for 8 months to every queer publishing house in America that accepted unsolicited manuscripts. Every literary agent that accepted unsolicited manuscripts I reached out to. And at the beginning of the process, I kept hearing, "You're going to have no problem with this, Rich. Drag is so hot right now." And, thanks in no small part to that young person who was sitting in the audience at Illusions in the early 1980s in Atlanta, thanks to RuPaul, drag is this multi-million-dollar industry, and it's part of our pop culture now. And so I kept thinking, well, there's not going to be a problem. Well, then Charlie's home state, Tennessee, passes this drag ban. And suddenly, when that becomes law, there's this immediate cooling off of anybody wanting to publish a drag book if your name isn't RuPaul. Primarily because drag gets dragged into the culture wars. And so a lot of publishers suddenly don't want to get in the middle of a culture war, fire. So, I had I was still talking about it with, different people, and we were still shopping it when Charlie went into the hospital earlier this year, in the winter of 2024 here. And but then, you know, Charlie and I, what turned out to be our final phone call, he called me from the hospital before his heart surgery. And, we had a conversation, and I could tell that he was anxious about the surgery. And so I was looking to uh, looking to lessen his anxiety, because Charlie is now my friend. And so not only as his co-writer, but as my friend, I wanted him to go into the surgery feeling good about things. And I said to him, I said, Charlie, the book is done. We got the book to the finish line. Your story will be told. And just in the moment, I said to him, because I knew he was headed into surgery, I said, you know what, Charlie, fuck the publishers. We'll do this ourselves. Your 75th birthday is coming up in December, and we will have this book out in time to celebrate your 75th birthday. All you have to do is recover, get well, rest up, and think about your book tour. And he says, that sounds great, baby. And so that was our final conversation. And so after Charlie's passing, I talked to Fred, his husband, and I said, as far as I'm concerned, Fred, the book is now locked. We can't make, outside of adding in the interviews that Charlie did, because the first thing a major publisher wants to do is change the basic concept of any book it isn't interested in. And so, I wasn't interested in talking to any publishing houses that say, well, we'd really love the whole center of the book to be about avocados instead of rutabagas. Well, you can't make those changes if Charlie is not here to represent himself. And I said to Fred, I said, we have a version of the book that Charlie loved. The entire last year of his life, Charlie would just call me randomly and say, Fred and I just lit up a joint. We're in the middle of chapter 7, and we're just laughing our asses off over here. And so I wanted the book that Charlie loved to be the one that went out to his friends and his fans. And so that's why we started Ardmore Avenue Publishing, which is my publishing company with my partner, Paolo Aguila, who is an amazing graphic designer. And so he was the one who came up with the suggestion. He said, look, we have a terrific book. You have the writing and the editorial side. I have the visual side. We have all the skills we need in-house to do this ourselves. And so I knew that by creating Ardmore Avenue Publishing, I knew that we would be able to tell Charlie's story visually and in print precisely the way Charlie wanted it told. And that there was not going to be any middle people telling us, well, we can't run that photo, or we really need this centerpiece to be about this. And so I wanted to keep my word to Charlie, but I also wanted to respect the integrity of what he wrote.
Well, even though I haven't seen the hardcover except for sitting right there beside your shoulder, I've seen the proof copy, which is basically exactly the same, except in digital format. And you're right, it's very welcoming. When you look at the book, it's not intimidating. You don't look at it and go, oh my God, the print is so small, I'm going to have to read, with a magnifying glass. It's going to take me 27 hours to read it. It was an easy read. It was refreshing. It was at times funny, at times sad, at times uplifting. There was all kinds of different emotions going on in there. And, as you said, you decided to go ahead and publish the final version that Charlie approved. And I remember when you posted online that you were going to publish it yourself, and you were taking pre-orders for the special edition hardcover, which is about to come out in, I guess, a few weeks. Obviously, you were right, because I have seen more people comment on your post. I just ordered. I can't wait for it to get here. When's it coming? When am I going to get it? And well in advance of Charlie's 75th birthday in December. It's going to be out in October. So
Our pub date is October 1st, 2024. And thank you for referencing the folks online, Art, particularly the now over 12,000 members of the Facebook group I Partied at Backstreet. Those folks have quite literally made Charlie's dream a reality by buying the pre-orders, by giving us the money to actually do this press run. And so we are so grateful to them. We were able to unveil the cover at Charlie's public memorial at the Georgia Aquarium this summer. And, you know, when Charlie passed away, for the private service that was held upstairs at the Atlanta Eagle in the now Charlie Brown Cabaret Room at the Atlanta Eagle. It's been officially renamed since Charlie's death. But Fred called me and said, "Would you do the eulogy?" And I said, "Fred, I would be honored to. I said, here's my idea. Charlie does his own eulogy. We use excerpts from this." And that's exactly what we did. So, Art, I can't even begin to tell you what it was like standing at a microphone, reading Charlie's excerpts from his memoir at his memorial service in front of his friends and his family and his castmates from the cabaret, and Charlie getting big laughs. And he would have loved that. He would have loved that. You know, the most revered reviewer, Kirkus Reviews, you know, and we were so proud of it, we put it on the cover. Kirkus Reviews says an honest, raw, and often graphic memoir. And if Charlie had been here and read that, he would have been on the phone to me, cackling his ass off and saying, my favorite part is the often graphic, because let's face it, the book reflects the bitch of the South, and it is often graphic. And so that's what I love about, you know, as a writer and as a journalist, I'm not so keen on becoming a publisher, but for Charlie's book and to get it out there to the many, many people who want to read it, this was the absolute best way to do it. And, you know, what we said about Ardmore Avenue Publishing is that we want to elevate marginalized voices. And so while we're not exclusively a queer printing company, publishing house, we are raising and elevating marginalized voices. And so I'm sure that many of our titles will be LGBTQ plus related. And I'm thrilled about that, because my own experiences in trying to sell the manuscript told me how much difficulty queer writers still have in what we think is a very progressive environment. There are very few publishers who are willing to take on anything that isn't guaranteed to sell 1 million copies.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for undertaking this monumental task. Although, as you've mentioned already, it brought a lot of joy to your life over the course of putting it together. I want to thank you for putting together the Ardmore Avenue Publishing Company. We will put the information in the credits at the end, so any aspiring LGBT or otherwise disadvantaged writers can, you know, reach out and have another door to knock on. You may not be able to answer it, but, you know, it'll be another option. And I want to thank Richard Ramey, because when he reopened the Eagle, he basically brought Charlie Brown and Charlie Brown's friends back into the limelight in the gay community. Even though he'd been working at Lips, Eagle is really a gay bar. And so, you know, he kind of elevated Charlie back up to that platform. And as you mentioned, the I Partied at Backstreet group, not only, I'm sure, has it been a big help in producing the book, But I think once the book is out, you may almost find enough content for a second book about other people telling their stories about Charlie Brown in response to reading the book. So you might have a Charlie Brown, you know, retrospective that is not Charlie Brown's words. But thank you so much for doing all that. And thank you for taking the time to do this interview today.
Art, I'm so grateful to you for your work with Gay Barchives and recognizing and documenting our history, because what you're doing is so important. And there are so many younger people who have come up to me, some of whom were at Charlie's memorial services, and they're grateful that Charlie was able to get this story down, because so many members of his generation didn't live to tell their stories, and their lives were cut short. And so I'm grateful not only to you for the work that you do, but to to people like Charlie for getting the stories down. I knew we didn't have a book contract, as we've talked about. We didn't have anything. All we did was we had a 30-year bond and trust between the two of us. And so, what I'm most pleased about is that as a journalist who covered Charlie Brown for 30 years, I knew the importance of getting this story down. I knew the importance of his history, not only in drag in the United States, but also just in queer history. I knew him as a trailblazer, but I knew, as you point out, I knew that so many other people didn't know the story. And so that's ultimately why I was so passionate about getting this book to the finish line, and why I'm so delighted to have been interviewed by you for Gay Barchives, because I'm such a fan of what you do with this work, Art.
Well, thank you so much, Richard.